Today we have a very special guest joining us, Lana Eagle. Lana is a consultant working on the side of industry to build strong working relationships with Indigenous communities within a reconciliation framework. Lana is an Uber volunteer. She serves as director on the boards of the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, Geoscience British Columbia, and the Association for Mineral Exploration in British Columbia. More recently, Lana spends time speaking and lecturing on the topic of reconciliation in Canada. Thanks again for joining us on The Rocks. Let's dive in. Well, Lana, thank you so much for joining us on The Rocks. How are you doing today?
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm actually doing well. It's September 1st. Can't complain. It's fall, but it's still trying to feel like summer.
Yeah.
And it's the best time of year.
Yeah, it's a beautiful time of year. Could you tell me a little bit about what you do in the mining industry and how you got involved in the industry?
Sure. What I do is I work in that space between Indigenous communities and industry, and I work for companies to help them navigate through that. You know, for a lot of communities, it's been not being able to have that trust so much with people in the industry or government. So it is about building that trust, and how do we do that through an engagement process as well as a reconciliation framework? So a lot of my time is spent between communities and industry to help bridge and facilitate those discussions. How I got started, I was actually working for an Indigenous community. They were negotiating an agreement with an industrial minerals company. And it was through that I started to begin to realize that, you know, there is a need for someone to better help facilitate those relationships. So I've had lots of different experiences with exploration companies and mining companies, but each one of them is wondering, how can we do this better? I think that's the question that generates these kind of discussions when industry is looking at their relationships and realizing, you know, maybe we can do this better. And how do we do that?
We have a lot of listeners who are mining investors or investors who are looking at maybe taking their first step to invest in the mining space. How can an investor really determine whether a company truly wants to do better versus maybe is just doing some kind of surface level work and talking points? Like, how do you really determine the level of seriousness that a company has about these issues?
Well, I think it starts, you know, just by doing some initial research. So if you're looking at a company, you'll probably look at their website and see who is on the board and who is in the management part of the company, and see if there's any reference to Indigenous communities, you know, who is responsible for that. And I think having a conversation with that person as you're looking at this information, you know, to look further into their website to see, you know, how they're building relationships with Indigenous communities. How do they address it when it comes to community engagement and sustainability? And so you begin to see sort of the culture of the company and the importance of working with Indigenous communities. I think if there's an absence of any of that information, you might want to really consider, if that's important to you, the social side of mining. I think it's important to have those kind of conversations and to see that there is work being done in that particular area. And some companies are really doing well in this arena. You know, they've established people, you know, it's part of their KPIs to work with communities. Others may just have the words and may not necessarily be doing what they say they do. So I think it's important to check that out.
And can you talk a little bit about the impact on a community and on a mining project when companies do follow through on what they say? And what does that look like? What does right look like?
Well, I think following through on what you say is extremely important. And I know that it's not always possible to follow through because outside factors, you know, may impact decisions going forward. So if your initial approach to a community is based on a 5-year exploration program, and let's say by year 3, things change remarkably so that it just doesn't make economic sense to be exploring anymore, that's the time to have a conversation with the community so that they know that it's not possible to go forward and not just sort of disappear.
Yeah.
and the community's left there wondering, like, what the heck? And I think that has sort of been the old way of doing things, where there has been less of a relationship and minimal communication. So communication becomes really key in terms of finding out what are the environmental issues of the community, how they want to, see a social change perhaps in their community, and how can a mining company become more involved in these particular areas. So if it's an environmental issue and there's concern around water, for instance, to have a community have that discussion with the mining company around water and how water is going to be taken care of is really key. Oftentimes we think it's this community may not understand mining, and really what it comes down to is traditional knowledge and Western science, and finding a way to make that work together so that everybody is on side and everyone is working together. So that can bring about some really key changes. And in all of that, a mining company has an opportunity, or a mineral exploration company, to build trust. Because sometimes that trust is just not there because of the history of Indigenous people have not trusted the government, how they have not trusted perhaps the church, and especially, around residential schools and how it's affected children and families. So now to move into a mining agreement where there's a promise of all kinds of training
Education
and jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of misses the mark, and they're still not addressing those important things. And I think it's about having conversations that really show that you really do care and that you really do want to invest in the betterment of the community and not just in taking the mineral out of the ground.
From my experience in what we would call emerging and frontier markets, North Africa, Central Asia, one thing that I have seen to proven out time and time again is when you're going into a new community and you have zero trust. In many cases, you have a Western company going into, an area that may not even recognize their own central government or have much to do with them. If you start the conversation by asking that community what do they need and what do they want, before coming in with all kinds of grand plans as to what it looks like they need from the outside, I'm reminded of many stories from my time in Afghanistan where well-intentioned groups would go in and start to bring in running water to communities, not understanding that in Afghanistan, in many communities, going to the well was the only acceptable time for women to leave their homes alone and talk to each other and congregate and catch up, right? So if all of a sudden they have water at their home, they now lose their opportunity to socialize within that culturally accepted system. So, we oftentimes don't ask first before we turn into a good idea fairy coming in to say, oh, here's what you need. Here's what we're going to do for you.
Exactly. And one good example, that I recently heard a lady present on a webinar, an Indigenous woman who is CEO of a power transmission company in Ontario. And they were looking for a partner. And the first company that came and spoke to them had all the answers. They had figured it all out. This is how we're going to work together. This is how, we're going to make an impact on your community. And then the second company came along and said, you know what? We need to engage with you first to find out what is important to you. In the end, they ended up choosing to go with the second company only because their view was going to be taken into consideration, in making any decisions. My mantra is early engagement. How could you possibly know, what positive changes will impact a community to build trust if you never talk to them and you're only what you think engagement might be is just to go and tell them about the project and all the good things. And that's the other part of, building your relationships is it does take time. So it may not happen overnight and it may take a few years to build trust. I know time is money, but at the same time, to put together a project and spend all that money and on studies and putting money into the ground, only to find out that the community does not want you there, that is time and money wasted. But, it's hard to start a project when you don't have the social desire for the project to be there. This is where it's a little different for some companies. Where do we start and how can we do this properly?
Yeah, and I oftentimes think Geologists are probably the worst at this because anytime you have a prospector or an exploration geologist go out and they find something, they're going to tell everybody, oh my God, this is going to be so amazing. I always used to tease them that, you go out and you think you found the big one, right? And so you talk about the fact that you might have just found the big one. And then people think, oh, okay, right? This is going to be the big one. And then, oh, wait, there's like 60 different decisions between here and there before it's built. That very first interaction can really set the tone, even for companies or groups that come in behind as well, right? The communicating about the risks associated with mining and the different decisions that go into it have to start at the very beginning because the project may be handed off to somebody completely different, right? And they make decisions different than you do.
I think another part of the equation that becomes extremely important is the communities themselves and how they are positioned, for mineral exploration or mineral development in their traditional territory. So a really good example here in British Columbia is the Tahltan in northwestern BC, and they have developed their protocols. And it's interesting, because the Golden Triangle is situated in their traditional territory, and there is a plethora of mineral exploration and major companies wanting a mineral claim, to go after. Copper is extremely important, gold. So it's rich, it's well mineralized. The Tahltan, kudos to them because they understand the importance of building relationships and what that might look like in terms of agreements and everything else. It's not often that you're going to get a community or a nation that is well positioned to have those protocols in place. But I think that makes a big difference because then when you are in those traditional territories and you are exploring or mining, you get a real good sense of what it is like to work responsibly and sustainably with an Indigenous community. I see the Tahltan is setting new ways and being able to communicate that with mineral exploration and mining companies, but also setting examples for other Indigenous communities on how they could possibly position themselves as large areas are being explored or mined in their traditional territories. So I think we are seeing a real change in Canada.
That's a great example. And I wondered if I could loop back to a phrase that you used earlier when you were talking about kind of what you do. You used the phrase reconciliation framework. And I wonder if you could explain for folks what that means who maybe aren't familiar with that and how is that different from, what we've been talking about in terms of communication and partnership. Like what is reconciliation as opposed to maybe what people think of as ESG or CSR?
Yeah, I think reconciliation, in my view, brings in humanity into the equation. So, a reconciliation framework is trying to find a way to make things work. And when you approach it, you're coming at it from the aspect of what can I do to make reconciliation work better? And so you're not thinking, well, what can the government do? What can this company do? What can this community do? Have all kinds of ideas and attitudes that may run differently than what's being presented. And I think a lot of times it's being able to check that way, that mindset that we've had for so many years and perhaps many generations, and look at, how can I be better in terms of finding a way to work with people? So I'll give you an example of a friend of mine, and she may be even listening to this, but when the Black Lives Matter movement took hold last summer, in Canada around the same time, there was a small movement of Indigenous Lives Matter. I'm on Instagram, so my friend messaged me through Instagram and she said, "Oh my God, Lana, I didn't even know I was racist." And it struck me as being funny.
Yeah.
We could laugh now, but the whole thing about systemic racism came out and what Indigenous people endure in Canada. She's a third generation geoscientist. So, some of the talk around the dinner table was certainly based on ideas of Indigenous people that may not necessarily exist or be truthful. So she was just in shock about herself It's interesting because I had two other friends also with almost that same phraseology admit to their ignorance and their racism, which was unintended, but it was just the ideas that they have had in their lives and trying not to understand. So I think, recently with the discovery of the unmarked graves here in Canada, I've had lots of people email me and message me and just aghast at even knowing that this could even happen in a country like ours. Canadians, one by one, from a very grassroots person working on the ground in a company or a CEO of a company, have just started to realize, wow, how could this even be possible? The one thing that really brought it home was the fact that it was children. People could relate because everyone has a child or a grandchild. They couldn't imagine that this would be the truth that some people had to endure. When I talk about a reconciliation framework, I'm talking about trying to build something that is based on genuine relationships. And that might be hard to step away from that engineer or that geoscientist mindset and move into a place where there's more humanity, where you're not afraid to be more human. And I think you know what I mean by that. Sometimes it takes an atrocious, horrific situation to move people. I think this is what has happened in Canada, not unlike what's happening in Afghanistan. It's that horrific, that's what's moving people. And unfortunately, something like that to move people.
When things like that happen, what I connect with that phrase of reconciliation framework is going in under the assumption that reconciliation is necessary, right? And that reconciliation is due, because many people, I think, before the unmarked graves became public knowledge, maybe questioned whether it was necessary or due. And once you see that things like that are true, then it really opens up space for people to acknowledge that a lot of the other things are true that communities have been talking about and trying to bring awareness to. That it's true that reconciliation is required. And certainly in what I've been going through for the last few weeks in Afghanistan, there are things out there that are true and hard to look at. And it's only once you start to look at them and see them in the light of day, I think that you can, human to human, start to understand how you can impact the people that have been victims in that situation.
Reconciliation, I think, needs to be defined by the community, by Indigenous people. Your concept of reconciliation, my concept of reconciliation, because I don't live in a community or on a reserve, might be different than someone who is grassroots living on a reserve. And why I say that is because, we look at our own industry, the natural resource development. I remember reading articles when media was trying to capture, let's say, a community getting a new water treatment plant or a community getting a new hospital or a new school. And some of the comments from the chief or from the counselors were, now this is reconciliation. And so bigger than a mine. And we have to keep that in mind always. And I think at the heart of it, it's listening to people and building that trust. So, you may be the only non-Indigenous person that they will ever really work with, but you want that to be memorable and lasting, and for people to be able to say, I really trust Emily. I don't know anybody else who's not Indigenous, but I really can trust her. And so that starts to build that trust, and it becomes a good relationship that they can point towards and realize trust does take time to build on both sides.
How should the industry be thinking about how to manage that relationship or honor that relationship when things go poorly? Everyone's sunshine and rainbows at the beginning, right? And then when you have an environmental issue or, something does go wrong at the project, how do the companies need to be addressing that? Going back to constant communication, I'm sure, but there must be some best ways to handle those situations.
I would say when you're having your initial negotiations and setting up agreements, you figure out a process for ongoing communication and also, what's going to happen? Who do we contact when something goes wrong? I mean, we all would like to make promises that, oh, don't worry, nothing will ever go wrong. We're fine. but something might go awry, whether it comes down to something at the employment level or something that is environmentally based, like a tailings breach, things like that that can go awry. And I think there just needs to be trust in process that is set up. So, what that is between the company and the community, how they want to deal with things. And to refresh that, meaning, in the 2 years that you've been working together, nothing has gone awry, but it's important to go back to that, because people change, whether they're, running an exploration project or a mine, or whether it's the governance of a community, people change. And so I think it's important to go back to that and review it on a regular basis. And if you are communicating regularly, it shouldn't be a challenge.
And that's where I know also the communication on the technical aspects of the project can be really important, right? And not just talking about, oh, here's how far along the development cycle we are, or here's what we need to buy, but understanding and allowing input for things like tailings ponds. I know you and I have talked about that before, and what technology will be used on site can be really important. And the more people understand about how things will be done from a technical perspective, then the more they can understand the risks and benefits of those applications.
Mm-hmm. A colleague of mine for a company that's developing in Nunavut and looking at construction, they've had many, many years of working with Inuit. And a lot of times there is a language barrier. English speaking engineers have had to go into communities and discuss the project, which would then be translated. So that tells me that if that can be done through a translator, then there are ways to convey in English language, in colloquialism, what a project is and what the issues might be and how can we work together to mitigate some of these issues. So it's making that communication work. It's not that we can only understand this project if we speak to it in engineering language.
Yeah. Well, I would say that goes for investors as well, right? Like I always tell folks if they're looking at projects and they're talking to management or key people on the team and they're using big words that you don't understand and they can't answer your questions in a simple, direct way, don't invest in that company. I mean, sure, there's so much complexity and technical jargon that does go into what we do, but nobody should ever have to be able to speak geology or speak engineer in order to understand what's going on at a project, whether that's a local partner or an investor, right? If you don't understand it, don't put your money into it. If they can't clearly communicate it to you, the one with the check, then they probably can't clearly communicate it to their own team and their stakeholders.
Yeah. Yeah. So exactly. So it's not being afraid to find a way to explain something in a way that someone can understand.
Well, Lana, I've been asking our most recent guests the same question kind of as a last wrap-up question, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and change or improve something about the industry, what would you change?
We're probably going through that change right now, and that is being able to see the humanity in people, that we can step away from those titles and whatever our education is, and to see things in more a human perspective when it comes to who communities are, who Indigenous people are, and look at the impact that we bring to a community in that light. It's not being afraid of being human. And I'm seeing more and more of that. I think people are understanding that it is necessary to be human and to want to understand and to want to bring positive impact to communities. And yeah, it's happening. Maybe not to the same degree that I would like it to happen, but certainly, I just have to wave my magic wand a bit more.
Just keep waving, right?
Yeah, but I think the pandemic has brought that to us. We've been isolated for so long and on Zoom for so long and given us time to reflect and to think about things. And I think people are emerging, wanting to be better people, just because we don't know how long we have in this life. And we don't know how our lives will be impacted going forward. So it's all positive. I really believe it is.
Lana Eagle says, be more human. Right.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lana, for coming on, and we look forward to having you back sometime soon.
Okay. Well, my pleasure. And have a great day
Thanks.
from South Florida.
Yeah.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you to our guest and my colleague, Lana Eagle, for joining us on this episode of On the Rocks. To learn more about Lana, visit her on LinkedIn at Lana Eagle or check her out on Instagram and Twitter. For more about Prospector, go to prospectorportal.com or check us out on Instagram at ProspectorAI and LinkedIn at Prospector Portal. Thanks for joining us on The Rocks. Until next time, keep your glasses full and your ice cold. Cheers.